Hello and welcome to this week's review of the latest episode of the My Hero Academia Vigilantes anime, with the episode titled Mom Descends. And we kick off this review, as we always do with these reviews, by talking about the positives and the headline positives. The big things that I'm going to discuss over the course of this particular review. I think this was a very well constructed episode. It shows us how wide-reaching quirks can be within the biology of this world. Well, potentially, we'll get onto that shortly, and it helps to give us an insight into why Crawler is the way that he is. This is the episode with the na-na-na-na-na-na-na cat boss. I really wish I had a draw on that so I could have that whizzing about in the background, but hey-ho, we move on and do the best in what we can. This is another situation for me with these reviews where it feels like my opening praise is going to sound a little bit odd here, but I did love how this episode was constructed. Let's be blunt, this is a handful of episodes combined into one. 3 episodes from the manga combined into one entity, and the concern I've had in the past is that when you combine 2 different episodes from a manga or some other source material, you have the issue that the pacing can seem rather odd, to say the least. And you want a good example of that? See my review of the second episode of this season, or just rewatch the second episode of this season. You have had a very sharp shift in tone and feel between the first half and the second half, and I'm glad to say that that isn't the case here. Yes, the events at play here are very different, as this is ultimately a single series of events set across just the same day, so even with that being the case in the source material, it's much easier to stitch these all together into one thing. So I do think that that works well, and that does help it in its favour. Though I will admit there was a bit of a slight wobble pacing-wise for me when we got from them all talking in the apartment to then them being at the market. Not a major thing, and this is only something I really pick up upon because, 1, I've read the manga, and 2, because I do a lot of reviews and such like, and my own personal academia makes me a lot more sensitive to slight shifts at this, but hey-ho. You know, the point is that the average person watching this isn't going to pick on that quite as much, unlike someone like me who, yeah, you know what, you get the idea. But beyond that minor wobble, I think this episode itself still rises to the occasion and creates a fine bit of television. Not the best bit of television I've seen recently, but hey-ho. Given that, again, this is 3 different episodes from a source material combined together into one, and yes, not different in quite literal ways, but you ultimately have a fairly talky episode, a kind of set-up episode of action, then the big action itself. It does it all together. It stitches it all together well to create a fine piece of television, like I say. Yes, in the cold light of day, much of this episode is your standard superhero frolics for the most part, but it's still superhero frolics done very well. The action and animation remains top-notch. When it comes to doing these reviews, I tend to praise the action more, but you know what, I will just say is I think that the facial and reaction animation with some of our characters is really strong. I think that some of the facial expressions that we get from Popstep and how flustered she can look in certain reaction shots is just brilliant. It's not the best stuff I've seen in the series overall, both this and with the main series itself, but still it is presented in a way which is funny, fun and endearing and helps to really sell her character. It's moments like this that makes it feel like she is more of the emotive core to this series in comparison to, say, Knuckle Duster and Popstep, and it's stuff that really does help to sell her character and who she really is behind the Popstep persona. Yes, a lot of this stuff is rather cliched. It's the love triangle, will they, won't they, will they say they love this person or not, and will they admit their feelings? So, again, very cliched stuff that we've seen a million times before in different pieces of fiction, different pieces of literature, but it's the kind of material that, 1, we didn't really get in the main series. Well, seemingly there is towards the end of this, and it was done in a way which caused a lot of fans to drop a bollock over, but that's a discussion I think we'll have in a few months' time. But it's still done, again, in a way which is still good. It's still in a way which is functional and enjoyable. I will take how it's doing it here than how they did it with a rather extended period within Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., for an example, or a comparison, I should say. But again, when the quality is this good, I don't have an issue with stuff being cliched or not. You can have a piece of fiction which is cliched to hell and back, but if it's done in a way which is compelling and interesting, whichever ways that you define that, I'm more than willing to go with that. And this is another case, much like the previous episode, with its uses of the English language, and the episode, I think the one before that, where we had pictures from American comic book literature. It's stuff that they didn't need to do. They didn't need to take that step to make the reaction shots and the animation, the facial animation, be as good as it was in that first third of the episode. They didn't need to go that far, but they did it, and I do appreciate that because it helps to create an entity overall that feels just complete. Because let's be honest, with a lot of anime that I have watched over the past couple of years or so, the animators put all the effort in the world to the action sequences, but then the stuff leading up to that, the interpersonal stuff, the bits where our characters just talking or emoting, that stuff feels like the lesser entity, whereas here that isn't the case. It's all done to a high standard. I will admit, I think the facial animations, the discussion stuff in the first third is better animated for me than the stuff in the action sequence we get later on, but that's a different strokes for different folks thing, and I do think that the animation quality with our characters does dip slightly when we get into the stuff from the market onward, but from that point on, that isn't the focus. We pivot into more action stuff. And I have to say that this is an episode that really does manage to strike a decent balance with its action, its comedy, and its character building for what that it does with it. I wish that more had been done with regards to Crawler's relationship with his mother within this episode, as I think that at the end of the day, it really does just boil down to, he used to be under her thumb, and then he said no, and look, he's standing up for himself, and ooh, and yay, that shows character development, that shows growth, but its character development and growth ultimately exists within this episode. Like, there was no hint of this being a case for him before this, and certainly for the rest of this season, by the looks of things, it's stuff that's not really going to be relevant to it here. So it's like in any given episode of a sitcom where the black sheep of the family comes over, the drunk uncle or the mean grandfather, and then one of the father or the mother character stands up to them, and it's a big moment, and then that moment is never really brought up upon, and the character doesn't really change much from that point. Like, it ultimately feels like a bit of a sitcom level contrivance for a character development which itself feels that it's not really going to add much to anything, and it certainly doesn't for the remainder of the episode, what little there is thereafter. I mean, not to get it wrong, it's done well. It's done very well, and it works for the arc of a single episode. Again, in that sitcom, the long lost brother's come along, and he's a drunk, he's a nasty piece of work, like in that very, very fantastic episode of Dad's Army where Captain Mannering's brother comes along, and we find that he's just a nasty, horrible, bitter drunk, and he screws things over for Captain Mannering. That's a great bit, but all the character development that Captain Mannering got in that episode did not carry forward for the rest of the series, and certainly in the immediate term with this, it's stuff that isn't really carrying forward, but still, it's good for what it is. But this is stuff that feels as though it should be a bigger moment, particularly when you're bearing in mind the repeated theme, that repeated trope and signature within the main series about the relationships between children and their parents, and the impact that parents can have on their children's lives, and how in certain elements it can leave them in very dark places. And here, this is just a bit of flavour. Here's just an echo of that, and it all is an echo, but you can't really... Well, I can complain about it, but at the end of the day, this is stuff for the here and now, which is what it is. The story has already been written, so we have to roll with it. Even with all that said, the episode itself is paced well for a piece of television, though I still say that the weakness the episode ultimately ends up having is more with the writing, but even still, the writing is strong for what it is. Even though there are things I wish were elaborated upon, even though there are things I wish should have been built up upon more, at the end of the day, this is still a solid piece of television for what it is. It's still a solid piece of fiction, and I still enjoyed it for what it was, and for what it was bloody good. Now, from a more lore perspective, this is the first time that we can see definitively, well, we'll get onto that shortly, that animals also can have quirks that can be manipulated by trigger. And then just in the back of my mind then, I remember the moment in the episode where you've got Knuckles just saying, something along the lines of, well, I can't exactly interrogate a cat now, can I? Or words to that effect. And it just had me having a vision of he's got the cat tied to the table. So, alright, where's the trigger being made? Meow! I've heard that before! Because it's the kind of stupid, nutty thing you probably end up doing, but this is the first time that we can see that animals can also have quirks, well aside from Nezo from the main series, and this does start to beg the question exactly what quirks are and how widespread they really are, because in the series the big selling point is, around 80% of the world's population has quirks. Dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum. However, Is that the case? Maybe more people have it than they think, maybe less people have it than they think, and holy crap, now animals are getting them. What the hell's going on here? However, there is the argument the cat didn't have a quirk, and instead this is the end result of something being injected into them, making them act the way that they did. And as with the case with Nezu, he was a test subject, so that explains how he came to be. Maybe animals can have very, very, very minor quirks, and this is just stuff to bring that forth, and maybe they don't, and instead this is stuff that was injected into them to see, could an animal have a quirk, and these things are the end result of that. And this ends up meaning that, well, a number of things, that potentially quirks can be transferred to others by darker means, which, well, you know, you've seen the main series, and you've probably seen at least one of the movies, well, the second movie, kind of suggests that maybe they could be, with the right people working on it, or that maybe, you know, that animals can also have quirks, so that makes Coda's quirk a lot more interesting if animals with the quirks become more of a thing. Which, for the record, I don't think it will, and it never will, so let's pretend it will for the sake of the illusion that now Coda is now miraculously the most powerful character in the series, because now we can talk to seagulls that have lasers coming out of their eyes or something like that. But still, it's an interesting little, I'd hate to say it, an interesting little quirk, little interesting wrinkle as how these things go, because like I say, it begs two questions. One is the fact that can quirks be transferred by science, or is it that animals can also have quirks to some degree or another? I don't think this is a question that will be really answered, but still, it's an interesting thing to bear in mind, something to consider for, well, your own future reference, I suppose. I'm not going to consider it for that much, because it's not really to the point of what we're doing here. But still, it's an element of the episode that does help to make the episode itself a lot more interesting, because this ends up helping us to set up for an action sequence. This is honestly one of my favourite in the entire series, mostly due to the fact it's just so fucking weird, as it ends up helping to show just how strange and random quirks can be, and honestly how wild and random they really should be. When I first started watching this program years ago at this point, I found the ideas of quirks just being fascinating, because they weren't always just your standard superhero thing of firing laser beams and shooting bolts of fire and bolts of lightning, that it could be other things beyond just running really fast and throwing stuff really good and just being super strong. They can be something as random as someone has a washing machine for a head, or they've got like T-Rex legs or something along those lines, or they can manifest eggs and that's it, or they have a quirk that allows them to make sure their cup of coffee doesn't get cold so long as they're holding it. Just any random bullshit that you can think of can be a superpower, and some of that can be used for superpowered stuff. Other stuff just makes your life a little bit more or less interesting depending on what it is. And this is an episode that really plays into that by having a cat turn into a bus, or fusing with a bus, I should say, either because it itself has a quirk, it had a quirk put into it, but regardless, it ends up setting up for just a really off-the-wall, wild and wacky action sequence, the likes of which I really do wish we'd see in the main series, but the main series, regrettably often than not, just feels like it is leaning harder and harder into just more general anime action fighty stuff, apart from the odd time where it is just done for the sake of a gag. And this episode, whilst this action sequence is weird and eccentric, ultimately does serve a purpose and does help to develop the character. So it does prove that, yeah, you can have a character, our heroes fighting someone with a strange quirk, a comical quirk, and yet still have decent character development connected to that. Even if, again, I do think that it's a little bit on the sitcom lost brother angle, but it's still good in itself. And even beyond that moment, it's still an episode that gives us insight into Kroll and to why he is the way that he is. He is the byproduct of an overprotective, yet abusive mother. One that didn't encourage him in the same way that Inko Midoriya did with Izuku. And it's something that made him the way that he is. He was belted into becoming rather submissive. This leads to a young man who's easily bent by the will of others, that goes out of his way to please people he sees as being his superiors, and he stays very much in his lane. He doesn't ask for more respect, he doesn't demand more respect, and he doesn't really push himself out the way to do more. He doesn't seem to be someone who has many ambitions. Like, up until recently, he was perfectly fine with just being the neighbourhood, the friendly neighbourhood nice guy who would go around and pick up rubbish and help old people across the street. that was his lot in life. It wasn't a lot, but that was his life, and that was something he was perfectly content by. He was content with the fact he missed his high school entry exams to go to a hero college, just so long as he had the illusion that maybe the kid that he gave the hoodie to would become a great hero instead of him. He's someone who's become very submissive, and by extension, he lost access to the true nature of his quirk out of his mother's own overprotectiveness and the abuse of him. I will just say is I am not comfortable with the way, both in the manga and the anime, where it treats the kind of just abuse that he got as being a bit comical. Yes, I am using the word abuse rather, well, possibly not in a way that YouTube's going to appreciate, but you get the point. I think it's presented in a way which is too comical for my liking, and given that, again, this is a series that doesn't shy away from showing how this kind of behaviour can screw up a kid royally, the fact that it's ultimately treated in a rather, again, almost sitcom-like way of the overbearing mother does make me feel a little bit uncomfortable, especially bearing in mind in the immediate term their relationship doesn't seem to be built up beyond this point. Certainly not for the rest of this season as it looks, and from nothing I've read thus far from the manga here on out, so it ends up feeling as though it takes a very difficult subject matter, treats it too much of a gag, and then metamorphosizes it into being an excuse to give him a power boost. Which, I don't know, guys. I don't know. It rubs me the wrong way, but with that said, and while we're in that kind of area, let's get into the negatives. And I'll just say is, I think this is an episode beyond anything else that does kind of pack too much in at once. Like, yes, this is ultimately how this part of the story panned out in the manga. This is how it panned out in the source material, but with the source material, each episode was released a week after one another, or maybe a fortnight after one another, or maybe there's a break somewhere in between it, right? You get the idea. As such, as an audience member, as a reader, you have this longer build-up of time, which means that when this one-time power boost moment comes along, it feels as though there's a greater build-up to it, and it makes it feel more of a satisfactory moment when it happens in the episode itself. Here, it only happens only a matter of weeks after this series started, and happens in the course of just one episode, is built up over the course of one episode, and it ends up feeling a little bit more like a typical anime power boost, rather than the major point in a character's life as it felt in the manga. And this is purely out of presentation and pacing. I know this might feel a little bit anal, a little bit too analytical here, but it does feel as though that this is a case of it mishandles the material a little bit by virtue of the fact it doesn't feel as though it's built up to this. Like, all of this is happening over the course of one episode, whereas even if you split it into two, that would have at least spread things out a little bit more, and would have made it feel like it is more of a build into it, and again would have made it feel less like a typical anime power boost. Yes, at the end of the episode we get the thing of, oh, he's struggling to get it back, guess it must be a one-time only kind of deal, okay, good, but at the same time, getting to this point, it just feels a little bit odd to me. I don't think it quite sticks the landing for me. But that itself kind of plays into a wider issue that I have with this series as a whole, but that's something I'll end up discussing in the series overview in a few weeks' time. With that said, let's get into the overview and just say that I do enjoy this episode. Despite the issues I have with it, I think it is still fun and enjoyable, and it still gives us a decent insight into the nature of the character of Crawl and how he came to be the way that he is. It's just something I think that should have been elaborated a little bit more upon to make it feel a lot more satisfying, and I think it's a matter of timing which makes that end moment feel less significant for me. But then again, you have to bear in mind that I'm someone that has read the source material. As such, some of these moments, they lack the impact for me because I know that they're coming up. And there's also simply the fact that if I know they're coming up, it's about how it's handled, it's about how it's presented, how it is executed. And the execution for me is slightly off by virtue of the fact of though the pacing just feels a bit weird to me, and it does end up making it feel more like an anime power boost thing rather than a major moment in the character's life. And of course, there is the thing about how his mother's treatment of him does feel like it's played a little bit too much of a joke, which feels very odd, if nothing else, simply due to the fact of how similar kind of things are treated in the main series. Yes, I know you do get something similar to this with Bakugo's mother, but even still there, whilst that was slightly treated as a joke, it wasn't something that ultimately felt like this. Like with Bakugo, it felt as though it just gave him a bad attitude, whereas here, it feels as though it had a bit more of an over negative impact on his life. But I think we're getting into an area here which I'm not comfortable talking about. With that said, we're done. However, let's get into Comment Corner! It's time for Comment Corner. Going to do these ones in the here and now, and I realise I hadn't actually replied to the people that wrote the comments, so I just did that very quickly. So first of all, we have Big X1 who says, "This episode was stupid fun, I liked it." This of course referring to last week's episode Major. And yeah, I really enjoyed last week's episode as well. It was just, I wouldn't quite say it was stupid fun, but it was, I loved it. just an absolute thrill of an episode. And for comparison's sake, I did a few days after the fact watch the dubbed version to see how it handled the moments of English language in the episode, and yeah, it's just something. It's a little bit that's only works in the subtitled version. Sadly, they don't seem to have found a way around that. But hey, it's their way of doing things, their show. And we also have another comment. This didn't come up when I was doing the review originally. This comes from Jack O'Lantern and says, "I have a question regarding character design. Specifically, why does it seem to be a universal constant for fictional lovable arse hats to have sunglasses as a fashion choice? For example, Captain Celebrity, Johnny Cage and Booster Gold. Why do sunglasses seem to fit this character archetype so well?" Well, honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's one of those things we're kind of preconditioned to just assume being a sign of pretentiousness, for want of a better phrase, because let's be honest, sunglasses can be something that a lot of pretentious and self-important celebrities end up wearing, so when we see characters acting that kind of way, it ends up becoming a nice little trope and a little playing for that. It's a bit of an interesting question, and we're talking about something that's far too grand for my humble mind to comprehend, but still, back to me a few moments ago before I realised I skipped this comment. Next up we have Scott TV Gamer, who said, "Interestingly, in the first chapter episode of the main series, Bakugo appeared to be going down a similar path to Captain Celebrity, even declaring he'd become one of the richest people in the world. Horikoshi, I apologise if I mispronounced that, said he regrets making him seem so bad at the start, seemingly just in reference to the line of him telling to Deco to, you know, do things to himself, but maybe he was talking about that as well." Thank you for your comment. I think this is, a lot of this stuff is regarding Bakugo towards the start of the main series is hangovers, and I think that there was a plan to have Bakugo become a villain in the end, and you did effectively see the growth of Midoriya becoming a hero and Bakugo becoming a villain over the course of the respective series, or over the course of this series, and you get the idea of the real course of their respective storylines, I should say, and those are just hangover bits from that. But I do think is that at the very least it does show just how the character has developed, where he can go from someone who is just driven by a desire for wealth and fame and reputation and saying horrible nasty things to people, to growing into more of a mature hero as time has gone by, even if he's still at this point still a bit of a turd, but in a more than understandable way. I have to say, I've been re-watching some of the main series more recently, and the character development of him from where you see it in the beginning of it to even just like midway through it, it's really interesting to see how he develops. And just seeing him become a genuinely interesting hero at that. But that's a video for a whole other time. Well, that's then done. However, let me know what you all thought about this week's episode. Whether you loved it, hate it, let me know in the comment section down below, and you'll be read out in a future video. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and see you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!